Good evening, everyone.
כבוד הרב, you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay, so we're starting with Yud. It says over here, Rav Nachman, the tour, Katan hayodeh lemisha mevarchin lav alav. So what does this mean to say? Mezamin alav. That if you have a katan, right, child, he knows who you're blessing. In other words, he knows who's God. So we can also combine him, right, to the zimun. It says the Bet Yosef, it brings a source, Perek Shlosha She'achlu. This perek over there in Brachot, right, brings that down. And then he says, מה שכתב רבנו, וכן כתב הרמב"ם, so the Rambam says, שנסתרף בין לשלושה בין לעשרה. So the Rambam says, right, he combines whether to 3 people or to 10 people he combines. So says regarding that Bet Yosef, שיעורו כך וכך. וכן כתב הרמב"ם. That's the way this is the Rambam writes, Kedivri Arif, like the Rif. וכתב עוד שמצטרף בין לשלושה בין לעשרה. לפוקי מהרב פרץ שמחלק ביניהם. So he said, right, you can combine whether it's 3 people or 10 people. And then we have another opinion, Rabbeinu Peretz, who says that, you know, they're not the same, 3 and 10. Okay, so we'll see how that works in the halacha and the Shulchan Aruch. So it says, "Mash katav Rif ben tet yud." Right. So according to Rif, we're talking about 9 or 10 years old. That's the one that combines with the zimun. So you guys understand why does it say 9 or 10? Well, it's either one or the other, right? I mean, what do you mean 9 or 10? You understand what that means when they say this kind of thing?
כבוד הרב, is this the age for training Hinuk? No?
Well, according to him, that's the age, you know, but the question is, why does it say 9 or 10?
I thought that was the age. Isn't that the age?
You understand my question? In other words, either it's 9 or 10, you know, why this or this? What does that mean?
Is that the age you're referring? That's my question.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I guess it depends. I don't know. The maturity of the child, no?
Right, that's it. That's the answer. It depends on the maturity, you know? So if he's mature, then 9 is good, you know? If he's not so mature, then 10. That's what it means to say. Exactly. Okay, great. So he says, Bet Yosef, regarding that, it seems like it's not precise. Because the Rambam katab ben sheva ushmone. Right, Rambam says 7 or 8. ולא משמע דפליגי, so it doesn't really imply that they argue, באחי, אלא ודאי כל תינוק שיודע למי שמברכין, מזמנים עליו. So he says, right, there's really no argument here. 7, 8, 9, 10, it really depends on how mature he is, you know? So what does the maturity have to do with? That he knows who's God, you know, who you're blessing. That's what it's all about. Okay, great. So, והוא שהגיע לעונת הפעוטות, דהיינו בין 7 ו8, right? So he says that he came to the age of pautot, right? Which means it's like training, 7 or 8. כל אחד ואחד לפום קורבה. Each one according to his maturity. אבל קטן ביותר, שלימדו למי מברכים אין מזמין עליו. But he says if he's really, really small, and they explain to him, who's God, still we can't combine him, too small. שאף על פי שהוא משיב, right? כששואלים אותו, even though he'll answer you, right, if you ask him, you know? You know who's God? You know who's Hashem? You know him? Yeah, I know. Yeah, okay. But still, that's not enough. He has to be a little bit more mature. למי שמברכים, כששואלים אותו, למי מברכים, אין לסמוך עליו, כיוון שהוא קטן ביותר. We don't rely on that because he's very, very small. In other words, it's like, when they answer you like this, like very small children, it's like, you're training a dog, like to wave at you, to wave hello and goodbye. It's not really, what you're looking for there. It's not really the trick. Just because you habituated him to do some answer, some like some kind of a parrot, it's not what we're looking for. He has to actually know what that is. Okay, so בכל מקום, אחד מעצמו יודע להשיב למי שמברכים אפשר, but he says if he knows how to answer himself without being trained for this, habituated, שאף על פי שהוא קטן ביותר. So then he says could be, even though he's very small, we could combine him perhaps, in a case like that, where he knows how to answer by himself. You didn't have to train him for that. אבל מצאתי לרשב"א, so he says I found in the Rashba, כתב על דברי הריף, he writes regarding the Rif, בין 10 ובין 9 נראה מפני שהוא זמן חינוכו. So he says, right, that why 9 and 10? Because this is a time of training, right? עד כאן לשנו. ולפי זה, גם בין 7 ובין 8 דנקת, so it's according to this, right? Also that which the Rambam said, right? 7 or 8, משום דזמן חינוכו, also because of that. Because it's a time of training. אבל בציר מאחיו, but it says if it's less than that, אף על פי שהוא יודע מעצמו, even though he knows by himself, למי מברכים, who you're blessing, אין מזמין עליו, we don't bless on them. וכן כתב הריב"ש, הריב"ש also says בתשובה, שאפילו לדברי המתירים, even according to the ones who are מתיר, לעשות קטן, סניף, צריך שיהיה בו דת. Still, right, he has to have some intelligence there. ויודע למי שמברכים, and he has to know who we're blessing, ולמי מתפללים, and who we are praying to, ושיהיה בין 9 או בין 10, so it should be like, right, 9 or 10, או לכל הפחות גדול מבין 6, right, or at least 6, right, okay, so now we're going down, right, אבל קטן מבין 6, but if he's less than 6, אפילו הוא חריף ויודע למי מברכים, even though he's, a sharp kid, he knows who you're blessing, ולמי מתפללים, and who you're praying to, and no, cool, that's no good, he says. שהרי לא הגיע לעונת הפעוטות, that's not training, והרי הוא כמי שאינו בן דת, so therefore we consider him to have no intelligence yet. Okay. Great. So let's move on. מה שכתב רבנו בשם רבנו פרץ, and then he wrote the name of רבנו פרץ, the tour, היי שמצטרף לעשרה, ולא שלושה, so he says they do combine to 10 but not to 3. וכן כתבו שם התוספות, that's what's in תוספות מורכי, שהוא דת רבנו תם holds that way. פירש שירושלמי שכתב, he explains that Yerushalmi that wrote, רבנו בסמוך, close by, the רבנו, מה יראה בזימון שלושה? We're talking about zimun with 3 people. אבל לזימון 10, but when it comes to 10 people, מצטרף לסבירה לרבנו תם. He does combine because Rabbeinu Tam holds the zimun b'shlosha chamir. He holds it 3. 3 zimun is more stringent. Zimun b'asad, more so than 10. כל מקום כתבו שלא רצה רבנו תם לעשות מעשה כדבריו. But he says, nevertheless, Rabbeinu Tam wasn't confident enough to rely on his own opinion, practically speaking. וזה לשון אורחות חיים, language of אורחות חיים, he says, כתב רבא, it says the רבא, דקתן מצטרף לעשרה. Right, he says the katan can combine to 10 people, ולא לשלושה, but not to 3. וכן בירושלמי, right, also in Yerushalmi, מתמה, right, it wonders about this, ואומר, אם תמן שמזכירים שם, שם שמיים, עושים אותו סניף, if rare, when we mention, right, the name of heaven, meaning what we name the name of God, so we do combine them. Here that we don't mention the name of God with 3, in other words, look, all the more so, right? We should combine him there also all the more so. Amar le, he answers him, דהיינו כלומר, היא הנותנת תמן על ידי שמזכיר עושים אותו סניף. כלומר, ב10 דוחקין עצמו לעשות סניף, כדי להוסיף בשבחו של מקום. אבל לשלושה לא אכפת לנו. So he says it the opposite way, right? Which is that, you know what it is? Like when it comes to 10, we really try, to combine because to get to that magic number of 10. So we're more lenient. But 3, we're not so anxious to get to 3. Not such a big deal, so therefore we're more stringent actually. Okay, all kinds of different ways of looking at it. Interesting. So we'll move on with the Bit Yosef. כתב לקולבו, says the קולבו, ולדעת אלו שמצטרפים אותו לשלושה. So it's according to the one who says that we combine him to 3, דווקא אחד, that's only 1 child. אבל 2, but 2 children, right? No, it's not going to be good. Why? דרובה דגדולים בעניין, because we want, majority to be, right, adults, אבל לעשרה יש מצטרפים אפילו 3 קטנים. But he says when it comes to 10 people, some even allow you to combine 3, children like that. כמו שמצטרפים ל3 אוכלי ירק. Just like, when we talked about combining the ones who eat vegetables, 3 people with the 7 people who ate bread. מה שכתב רבנו ויש נוהגים לצרפו על ידי חומש. So that which Rabbeinu said, right, that there are all those who are accustomed to combine him by way of chomesh shebeado. Oh, okay, not chomesh, chumash. So he says, right, that there are those who have accustomed to combine him by way of his chumash. So that's not a good custom, he says. Okay, yeah, well, it sounds a little bit strange. So what does he mean to say by that? He wants to say, right, that because he's holding a chumash, we're going to combine him. Go figure, right? What is that going to help you? Ken Katu Sham Tasot. That's what it says in Tasot Verosh, Mordechai, all these rabbis. Sheminhag Ta'ut Huzeh. So he says that's a mistaken custom. Okay, great. Let's see what else we got. So then it says the Tur. Umash Katav Adoni Aviarsal Hevi Halud Yerushalmi Amar Rabbi Yosef Kama Zimnin Achalit. Right. So he brings this Yerushalmi, right, the Rosh, and over there it says that Rabbi Yosef said that there were, this is several times I ate, right? So let me just see inside the Torah here what we're talking about. Right, it says like this: Achina im techalifa Abba ve'im Binyamin bar Shisha chavivi ve'lo zam le'alai. Look what he says, right? So he says, you know what? There were several times where I ate with these two rabbis, and they wouldn't combine me into the zimun, right? Ad Aiteti bet serot until I get some, hairs, right? Pubic hairs. In other words, he had to be an adult, basically, right? The kaf and kaf, right? So meaning what could be that they expected him to be like 20 years old. So he says, therefore, the best way to do it, right? It says, en osin katan snif leyud. That we don't do right. We don't combine katan with 10 people. Le לבית הכנסת לתפילה. When it comes to prayers, right, in synagogue, Gimel ad she'avi, and also to 3, right, for the zimun, ad she'avi b'el until he brings two hairs. So according to this opinion, he has to be an adult, so that's already, right, we don't paskin like that, but okay, whatever. That's the Yerushalmi. Okay, great. So we're done with the tour. That's the whole chapter there. So let's take a look at Bet Yosef, see what we got. So says Bet Yosef, Sham begam agot Maimon katvu bepek, right? Says also that this rabbi said, Beshem Ri, in the name of the Ri, she'en katan mistaref afilu lezimun shlosha. The katan does not combine even with a zimun of 3. The kol sheken dasara, all the more so for 10. The chamir mishlosha. So he says, you know why? Because 10 is more stringent than 3. Ad she'avish teserod, until he brings 2 hairs. וכן כתב סמ"ג, that's what it says in סמ"ג. ולכאורה משמע דסברי דאין מזמנין על הקטן. So he says apparently they hold that we don't combine a katan for zimun klal at all, right? At all. דכיוון שכתבו בעניין שיביא 2 שערות, because since they said, right, that we require hairs, which means that he's an adult, משמע דשערות ממש בעניין. So we need like really hairs, but ולא שומה, not a mole. Okay. Not a mole. So what's the difference between hair and a mole? What does that mean? So this is really, mentioned in the Talmud several times, this issue, right? The question, the issue is like this, right? Sometimes what happens is, when you have like a youngster like this, so he gets like, 2 hairs, but they kind of like disappear. So we say, right, that's a mole, it's not really serious hairs there. So you're not like you need like 2 real hairs, in other words, that they stay around, they don't disappear. Otherwise, it's just a mole. The whole Searot Shavi Kadam Yud Gimel, so he says whatever hairs he brought before 13, Shana V'Yom Echad Shuma V'Yom. So he says anything which comes before 13, it's just a mole. Oh, okay. So he says, but he says, I'm wondering why, because in the Talmud we concluded regarding that that we don't pass like these lessons. Right, like we pass like Rab Nachman. What did he say? Katan if you have a katan, right, who knows who you're blessing? We do combine him for zimun. So he says, how do they deflect the conclusion of the Gemara, right? Of our Talmud, because of Yerushalmi, right? We don't do that. That's not the way it's supposed to be done. We're supposed to go like the Bavli. Okay. So he says, even though Smag wrote, right, that there was actually a case, practically, but it says it's not enough anyway to deflect, the conclusion of the Talmud. We can't. Right? That's the halacha. ערוך שבעדינו. ונראה שהם סוברים, דאף אגב דקיימה לנו. So it seems like they hold, that even though we hold, Rav Nachman, like Rav Nachman, De'amar Katan Yodel Amim Merachim Vazamin Lav, that if the Katan, right, knows who you're blessing, that we do combine him in the Zimun. But we also require 2 hairs. Even though if he doesn't have 2 hairs, Afal Pish Yodel Amim Merachim, he knows who we're blessing. And Vazamin Lav. According to this opinion, we don't do Zimun with him. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so this goes like almost till the end of the chapter. So let's see what we can do. Maybe we can finish it. Oh, you never know. So yeah, it starts over here. So it says, the Talmud and Milta, what's the reason for this? Mishum de Mikmeha de Rav Nachman Itmar, because before Rav Nachman's statement, it was said in the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan said, Katan poreach mezamnin alav. So it says, if you have a Katan who's poreach, we do zimun on him, right? So poreach, what does that mean? He's like growing up, he's on his way, on his way to being a big boy. Tanya, right? It says in Braita, Nami Hachi, also it's in the Braita, Katan Shevis Teserot, that Katan who brought 2 hairs, Serot Mezamina, we do zimun on him. V'shelo Havish Teserot, but if he doesn't have 2 hairs, and Mezamina, then we don't do zimun on him. Then with Dr. Kim Katan, and we don't, we're not so particular with the Katan. Ha Gufa Kashya. So Gemara says, right? That's difficult, you're contradicting yourself here. Why? Because so isn't coming to include, right, a katan who is growing up, and they hold that even if you're going to tell me that it's not the halacha is not like any of these lessons. It also refers to this. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said, "Katan poreach mezamilav." The katan who's growing, what we do is with him. So he says, but we have to uphold the words of the Braita. The lo meshvinan le Rav Nachman cholek al Braita. So what does that mean? We don't want to say that Rav Nachman is arguing with the Braita, so we have to reconcile them. So he says, therefore, right, you have to say the chi amar Rav Nachman the katan yodeh. That when Rav Nachman said, Katan, who knows, right? The Mim Merachim, who are blessing, that we do zimun with him. Hainu dafka keshevish teserot. We're talking about when he has 2 hairs. The Katan of the Braita, like it says in the Braita, the lo ba Rav Nachman ela lefaresh. Rav Nachman is only coming to explain, right? The Tanya, the Katan shevish teserot, because that which we learned, right? In the Braita, that Katan who brought 2 hairs, Mezanila, we do zimun with him. Hainu dafka k'sheodeh lamim merachim. It's only if he knows who we're blessing. V'ashta ma'ite shapi raya Yerushalmi. So now it's good when he brings the right source from the proof from the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi mfaresh maskanat the Gemara adidan. So why? Because Yerushalmi is basically right explaining the conclusion of our Gemara with the Bavli. So it says this way you have to understand the language. That which we said, that you can't combine the katan unless he has 2 hairs. So that means that you see from there that if he did have two hairs, the katan who, even though he's katan, so then we do zimun on him. And when he knows, right, who we bless, Kidama Rav Nachman, That's only for those who were blessing, right? Like Rav Nachman said. Okay, great. ולפי זה, Tanya, so he says, according to this, right, that which we learned in the Braita, and medaktakin b'katan, that we're not particular about the katan. Hainu lomar, what does that mean? Therefore, gav the kaimalan, even though we hold be'alma, right, in general, the katan shevish tesarot lo chashiv gadol, the katan who has two hairs is not considered to be gadol. De'anach searot shuma be'alma, why? Because that's only a mole. L'inyan tziruf de zimun, when it comes to right combining zimun and medaktakin b'chach, we're not so particular like that. Ela kegadol shevish teserot, so it's like a gadol. He's considered like a gadol, an adult who brought two hairs. That's, we consider him like that. Mashma sheshte serot halalu. So that implies that these two hairs tzarich shiyu gedolim. They have to be big hairs. They have to be large enough, right, to bend over the top to the bottom, to the root. Wow. Okay. Kedin shte serot, like the little two hairs. The gadol of the adult. Rabbi Yochanan Hayar Otzelamar, and Rabbi Yochanan wants to say, Shapa pi she'enam gedolim, that even though those hairs are not really big, kolkach, they're not so big. Kivan shehem porchim v'yotzim k'tzat, but since they're already like protruding, whatever, growing, sagi, that's good enough. V'hainu de'amar katan poreach. Now that's what he said, right? That the katan is growing, right? It means that its hairs are growing. Mezamninan allowed that we do zimun with him. And he deflects it. And they were deflected. Rather, he says, we require that there should be long hairs, long enough to bend over the top to the root. So he says we can prove that that's what they hold. With the Satmud Ivrahem, because they wrote their words undefined. The Katvu ad she'avish teserot, and they wrote until he has two hairs. Mashma de teserot darukot k'mishpatan bainan. So that implies that we need normal long hairs, right, to for this purpose as well. That's what it seems from Rabbeinu Yonah. שכתב פירוש אחר בזה, he wrote different פירוש for this, different explanation. והעלה לפי אותו פירוש, he concludes according to that פירוש, according to that explanation, דאין מזמנין על קטן, that we don't do זימון על קטן, אלא או בשתי שערות או כשיגיע לגמר. So it has to be either he has two hairs or he's already 13. Okay, great. So let's move on. So he writes afterwards that many of the rabbis noagin al pi svarazo. He says they do like this opinion. That's how they're accustomed. When he's harim shelo lezamen ima katan. So he says they're careful not to do zimun with a child al sheikanes the bishnat yud gimel until he gets to bar mitzvah. And they rely on what it says in Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yosef, that Rabbi Yosef says, Zimnin Sagin, Havakaim Nakame de Chalifa Ba, de Chilfata, Bekame Rabbi Chanina, Barsisi, Bechavivi, Lo Havu, Mezamin Alai. So again, right, we're reiterating what this rabbi said, Rabbi Yosef, that what? That, he recalls, right, from his childhood, that he would sit with these two rabbis and they wouldn't combine from Zimun. Until I had two hairs, he says. Adkan, that's the end of it. Okay, so you see, right, there's a big machloket here regarding this. Whether, right, it's enough to, be just at the age of training, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like was this, right? Was that? Or it has to be actually bar mitzvah, or at least two hairs, one or the other, right? So several opinions we have here. So we're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch, right? If I recall correctly, in the Shulchan Aruch, he paskins there that 6 and 7 is enough. Okay, we're going to see that in a second, but הרי שהוא סובר שירושלמי בהביא שתי שערות קודם זמנו מהרה. So he says, you see from there that he holds the Yerushalmi that it has to have two hairs before bar mitzvah. ואם כן, יש לומר שהראש וסמ"ג, so he says, if so, there is to say that the rosh and the samag, שסומכים על ירושלמי, they rely on ירושלמי, כך הם מפרשים אותו, that's how they explain it, like that. ואתה שפיר עם מסקנת הגמרא דידן. So then it turns out good also with the right? The conclusion of our Gemara as well. אבל Mahari Kolon, but this rabbi כתב בשורש מ"ט. In this, right, he writes in this place שצריך להיות ben י"ג שנה. He says no, has to be 13, right? לדברי הפוסקים אחרונים, according to, he says, the later authorities, כמו רבינו אשר, like רבינו אשר, right? Who's רבינו אשר? That's the Rosh, right? His name was Asher. Okay, and then we have, right, Ubano Rabbeinu Yaakov and his son, right, Rabbi Yaakov, right? You know who that is, right? Betur in the Tur. That's the Tur. Or Chaim, right? Katav Gamken Shekak Katav Ri v'Samag. He says that the Ri and the Samag also wrote like that. She'en Naasot Pachot Mi Yud Gimel. They say, don't combine him until he's 13, right? That's it. Senif Dasara ושלכן אין להקל בדבר. So he says, therefore, don't be lenient, right, any more than that. So he says, even though that they're talking about prayers, since the Rosh, right, equates Birkat Hamazon with prayers, because he said, right, that we don't combine, right, 10 for Birkat Hamazon, and for prayers, for 3, until it's 2 hairs. So if it's regarding prayers, it means that he has to have 2 hairs. That means like 2 real hairs, not the mole, right, that we spoke about. Right? We don't want the mole. That means that he brings those 2 hairs, right, after he's already bar mitzvah. ביום אחד, ההוא הדין לברכת המזון. Same thing also would apply to ברכת המזון. בין ל10 בין ל3, whether it's right 10 or 3. לפי דבריו יש לתמוה, according to his words he says there is a wonder here. Why? היח דחה מסקנת הגמרא, how did he deflect, right, the conclusion of our גמרא מפני ירושלמי, right, because ירושלמי, again, right, same question that we had before. עד כאן. נראה לפרש דבריהם כמו שכתבתי. So he says, we can explain, right, like we said. In other words, really, what did we say? What was the idea there? How do we bridge the gap, right? We said that really, there's no machloket between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. It's really saying the same thing. There's a way to reconcile them. Okay, we'll see, right? So what's halacha? Bottom line, right? After all that discussion, so he said, since the Rif and the Rambam agreed to one opinion, right? That's how we paskin, he says. So he says, but you know what? In chapter 55, he says, I already wrote over there that we don't combine katan, right, with the minyan. So he says, that's different. Why? Because that's kedusha. That's something, holiness, right? So you see from there, right, that zimun and minyan are not always the same thing. They don't always have the same criterion. And that's similar to what we saw yesterday, right? When it comes to comparing one with the other, right? We said that mentioning the name of God already turns it into like a minyan kind of thing, right? When you have 10 people. But otherwise, zimun has a different kind of a thing, different kind of a rule than minyan. It's not the same thing. This is only zimun, he says. And even though in this parak in Gemara Mem Zayin Amud Bet, mashma ifcha, it implies the opposite. Because this rabbi says, even though it said, right, that katan, right, the child, who's lying in the crib, we cannot use zimun with him. But he says we can combine him with 10. It says it seems like going to his own reasoning there. The sober the achal be'asara sharia shchinta. that any kind of 10 people, right? There's always Shekhinah there. Doesn't matter whether it's children or not, whatever it is. Even if there's a baby who's in the crib, that's also right. He can also complete the minyan for interesting. Wow. אפילו יש ביניהם קטן מעוטר לריסה, שאין בו דת לדבר של קדושה, right? So he says, even though he doesn't really know, right, who we're blessing, which God we're talking to here, he doesn't know anything about that, right? But still, he has a holy soul inside of him. לא בעינן דעתה, אלא שתהא שכינה שורה עליו. So he says that we only require, his intention, right, his knowledge, when for the Shekhinah should be there. אבל בזימון בעינן דעתה שהרי המזמן אומר לחברו שיזמנו לברך. But he says when it comes to zimun, we just require, right, the knowledge that the one who's, right, doing the zimun is saying to his friends that we should do the blessing. בכל שיש ביניהם מי שאין בו דת. So therefore, if you have somebody there who doesn't have any intelligence, לא שייך זימון, you cannot do zimun like that. אלא אבל לדידן לדבר הקדום שבקדושה אין מצרפין קטן. But he says, according to what we said, right, according to us, that when it comes to something which is kedusha, we said, right, we cannot combine a child for that. Hamutal barisa, which was in the crib. Davar kedusha chamir mizimun. So there we see, right, that kedusha is more stringent than zimun. Mitama depreciate, for the reason that we explained. V'chen dat Rabbeinu Yonah. That's what it says, Rabbeinu Yonah. Shkatav gabe had yam Rab Nachman, because he wrote, right, regarding what Rab Nachman said. Katan hayodeh lamish mibarchin. That Katanu knows, right, who you're blessing, we can combine it with the zimun. The dafka le'inyan brachat b'kat hamazon osin otos fidipin. So we can do that with b'kat hamazon. Aval, lo lekadish lekdusha. But kaddish and kedusha, right, that's a very different level. That's like minyan, minyan kind of a thing. So that we cannot do, right? That's what the Baruch Hu, also Baruch Hu. That's what it says in some of the Geonim. Ad kan v'nireh shezehu dat Rif Rambam. So it says that seems to be like also the opinion of the Rif and the Rambam. Shelo izkiru tziruf katan. So they didn't mention, right, combining a child l'tfilah for prayers. We're not talking about zimun. Ulhedia katav Rambam perket minchot tfilah. So Rambam writes explicitly in laws of prayers and osim bechot me'asara gdolim. So it says it has to be gdolim, right? And people who are bar mitzvah for minyan. There's no other way to do it. וכן כתב הריב"ש בתשובה, so it's in the ריב"ש, שזוהי דת רמב"ם, the Rambam holds that way, משום דסביר עליה, because he holds, דכי הפסיקה, הלכתה כרב נחמן, when he paskin the halacha in Rav Nachman, like Rav Nachman, דאמר קטן היודע למי ממרחין, that he said, right, that קטן knows who we're blessing, מזמין לה, we can do zimun, דווקא בקטן הזימון הוא. That's the only thought regarding the zimun, right? So in other words, we see from here a clear, right, differentiation that zimun is one thing, right, and minyan is something else, two different things. So when it comes to zimun, we can combine a katan, right? Somebody, as we said, right, who's at the age of training, right? But when it comes to minyan, no way to do that. Forget about it. Okay, great. So let's go to Shulchan Aruch. I think we can finish the chapter today, Belina there. We only have like one more here. All right, that's good. What do we got here? So it says the Shulchan Aruch, Katan shegiat leonat apeutot, right? Ve'odea lemim merchin. As we said, right? We have a Katan who came to the age of training, and he knows who you're blessing. So we do zimun with him. Mistaref ben shlosha ben nesara. In other words, 3 or 10. Says Rama, ויש אומרים דין מצטרפין אותו כלל עד שיהיה בין 13 שנה. He brings the other opinion, right, which is they have to be 13. דאז מחזיקים לכגדול, שיביא בן צרות. Because then we say, right, he's gadol. He's an adult, right, who has 2 hairs. וכן נוהגים בין השנות. So it says Rama, right, that's our custom. So you see, there's a difference between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim here, right? The Ashkenazim are more lenient. We allow, right, 6 and 7. right? But Ashkenazim, they wait till 13. That's the way it is. Uh-huh. בחרש ושוטה, אם מכוונים ובינים, מצטרפים לזימון. So now adds the Rama another thing, right? Which is, what about cheresh and shoteh, right? So what is that talking about? Deaf mute, right? And retarded person. Do they combine to zimun? So he says, uh, if they have some intelligence, in other words, they know, right, who we're talking to. They know who's Hashem. So then he says, yes, you can combine them. So he says, even though the cheresh, right, he's deaf mute, he doesn't even hear the blessing. Nevertheless, right, he says that we do combine them. That's very interesting. He brings the name of the Maharil, so I'm just going to look at the Mishnah Brura here to see what he says about this. Maybe there's a machloket about this. Okay, first of all, he says one thing, right, Mishnah Brura. He says that we're talking about somebody who speaks but does not hear, right? So he's not a deaf mute, he's just deaf. Zero Becheresh Gamor says why? Because if it was really a deaf mute, he says, for sure he would be absolved from this. Why is that? Because we assume he has no intelligence, right? That's the thing. Wow, okay. All right, there you go. So Mishnah Brura, right, is already, right, he's he's narrowing down, right, this definition, to a more tolerable, right, level here. And then, right, he says another thing. He says, "Wow, interesting." So when we say shotet, right, he's retarded. So he says it's not talking about like fully retarded. He says, "And מצטרף אלא שאינו חכם כל כך כשאר אנשיהם מחזיקים אותו שוטה." Wow, wow. Look what he says. Wow. So he says we're not talking about somebody who's fully retarded. Why? Because somebody like that, we assume that he has no intelligence. He has no right. He's not intelligent. He doesn't have a right proper, brain power there. So he says we're talking about somebody who's like semi-retarded. Right? So what does that mean, semi-retarded? He's kind of like slow. It's like he's not exactly up to par. I'm sure you've met people like that. Oh, he's a little bit retarded. A little bit. We've met people like that along the way, in life. So I'm sure you know what we're talking about. Anyway, that's how Mishnah Berurah defines it. That makes it more easier to swallow, the way he says it. Why? Because if it was really fully retarded, right, or like a full deaf mute, then they have no intelligence. I mean, so how can they combine? So, that helps us a little bit here to digest this whole scenario. Okay, so we have like one more piece here, very short. So I guess we just might as well do it. It'll take 2 minutes, or less. 2 minutes or less. Okay. So it says in the Torah like this: "Misheniduhu al avera katabti b'siman nun hey shen mazin rav." Oh wow, look what it says, right? So what are we talking about here, right? Somebody who was excommunicated. Do we do zimun with him? Right. So he says we already wrote in chapter 55 that we don't do zimun with somebody who's excommunicated. Okay, very simple. So let's see Shulchan Aruch and we're done. Same thing, right? Mishenidu al avera bizman sheutar mitzad asara and mizamina. Wow. So it says somebody was excommunicated because of a sin that he did. We don't do zimun on him. But he uses these words over here, bizman shehutar mitzad asara. Oh, I see. Oh, you know what he's saying over here? He's saying, right, there's a thing like this where somebody gets excommunicated, because of a sin that he did. But you know what it is? Because he's like a big shot, like he's a, president, governor, something like that, right? Mayor, he's like a big shot, So we kind of like, go lenient with him. We let him off the hook because of that, We don't want to mess with people like this, who in places of authority, But he says, nevertheless, we don't combine him to Zimun. So what does that mean? The only reason we let him off the hook is because, he's a prominent person, Somebody we don't want to mess with. So since that's the reason, otherwise he really should have been excommunicated. So therefore we don't combine him. That's what he's saying. So let's see, there's a Mishnah Berurah here. If you add something interesting. Uh, yeah, so Mishnah Berurah, just pretty much reinforces the whole thing. So he says, right, that's a definition of excommunication, he says. That's a definition. So what does that mean? We separate him from the community, So if we're separating him from the community, how can he do zimun with us, right? That's the whole point, to keep him out of that. That's the whole purpose of nidui, excommunication. Okay, very good. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. B'ezrat Hashem, Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless. All the best.
Thank you so much.
God bless.